welcome to Page Turner. Today we're joined by a historian who needs no introduction, Mr. Ramachandra Guha. His latest book, Rebels Against The Raj, chronicles the lives of 7 incredibly interesting foreign people who dedicated their lives to helping India fight for independence. Some are more well-known, like Annie Besson, while others are being documented properly for the first time in this book. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Guha.
Thank you, Vandana.
You write that today's India, which is increasingly becoming more xenophobic and nativist, believes no foreigner can teach them anything. This book is about 7 people, all foreign-born, all white-skinned. So my first question is, what abiding lessons do you think they have to teach?
What? Can you just repeat the question? The last part I didn't get.
What abiding lessons do you think the people that you're writing about have
I
to
think
teach?
they'll have to read the book. They'll have to read the book. These were 7 extraordinary individuals who span a century of Indian history. Annie Besson is the first to come in 1893, who, as you say, is quite well known. The last to die is relatively unknown today, a remarkable American Christian ecologist called Dick Ketan, who dies in 1984. And they live in different parts of India, completely immerse themselves in our culture, in our politics, in our society. And it's a 400-page book. I can't give a single lesson in 5 words, but I'll just say this, that it's not only in India that xenophobia is sweeping a particular country. It's true with England and Brexit. It's true with Xi Jinping and China's portrayal of itself as the center of the world and destined to rule the world. We know about Trump and the white supremacists. In other countries like Turkey, Russia, and so on, other countries with great civilizational histories based on encounters with other cultures. You can't understand Turkey or Russia or America or China or Britain or India. You can't understand the history without the exchange, the interactions between different cultures, but yet they want to pretend that they are the center of the world, they can teach the world, and they can learn nothing from the world. But that's the lesson of the book. But the meat of the book is these 7 remarkable stories. So it's really the biographies of these individuals, what they did, how they struggled, what kinds of Indians they befriended, what kinds of Indians they sometimes argued with, because some of the debates they undertook are also very instructive. Today, for example, since I'm speaking to you at ThePrint, B.G. Honeyman, a journalist who fought fearlessly for freedom of expression, was deported by the British for 7 years, who organized the first trade union of working journalists, who was often in court, defending himself against libel suits brought by other kinds of people. So his lesson is the life of B.G. Honeyman is incredibly relevant to the fragile state of the free media in India today. But the other lives may be relevant for issues such as gender equality, environmental sustainability, and so on and so forth. So they're 7 very different lives, but all united by the fact that they came to India and were either arrested or deported for identifying with India.
Mm-hmm. So whose story is your personal favorite, and what surprised you the most about it?
Well, I've been asked that question, Vandana, and I've answered it in a very simple way. If a parent has more than one child, the parent is not supposed to play favorite. Some parents do, but I don't think I do. I have 2 kids, a boy and a girl. I found all 7 absolutely absorbing. And that's been true by previous biographical subjects too. I can't say I preferred writing on Gandhi to writing on Verrier Elvin, or I preferred writing on Elvin to the Dalit cricketer Palwankar Balu, on whose life I wrote I centered a column of Foreign Field. So all these, I chose 7 people, I just say this, all of whom interesting, remarkable, often controversial, combative, and on each of whom I had enough primary material. So they may have been, it's possible that I missed out 1 or 2 individuals who did not leave their traces adequately. So I don't have a favorite among the 7. I'm sure readers will. People will say, I prefer X to Y, or this chapter particularly gripped me, or I knew about this person before, so this is not particularly new. But I don't have favorites. I don't have favorites among the 7 individuals in this book, and I don't have favorites among the other books I've written. Each one of them is precious to me.
Right. I mean, this book tracks some very colorful people. We have unrequited love, we have revolutionary love, possibly homosexual love.
Yes.
There are some really touching letters in the book from Meeraben to Prithvi Singh, Philip Spratt to his 1-year-old son. So what kind of window does your book offer to that turbulent India of Yeah.
So I think it's 100 years of Indian history, and it touches many parts of India. So, Hollyman worked in Bombay, Annie Besant worked in South India, Miraben traveled all across Bihar and central India before settling in the Himalaya. Stokes, of course, was a pioneer of the horticultural industry in Himachal. So he's still central to the history of that state. So many different parts of the country, both the colonial and the post-colonial period. So I think it is, of course, it's essentially a story of 7 individuals. But if you pick your individuals wisely, Vandana, then biography can become a window into history. Because if the individuals you're writing about have either responded to or shaped profound historical events, then their story becomes the larger story. So this is a story of the Indian challenge to British imperialism, the complicated and painful transition to an independent nation, the unresolved questions of justice, equality, fraternity that are still with us, which some of these individuals tried to fight. But so it's biography and history. You could say it's biography as history. So it's not just 7 random, unconnected stories, that are just there, to fill the pages, as it were. I think each of these left their traces in the form of primary materials I could gather, synthesize, scrutinize, assess, try and present in some kind of coherent narrative. And I like, if you look at, even economic debates, if you look at Philip Spratt, who started as a communist and ended as a pioneering free marketeer, one of the first critics of the license permit quota Raj, and a great influence on Sri Rajagopalachari and the Swatantra Party, but also a person who fell in love with this very, resolute and admirable Tamil girl called Sita, and their story. I mean, an interracial marriage in the India of the 20s and the 30s, and people who are really lower middle class. It's very different. If you have marriages, interracial marriages at the absolute elite, JRD Tata marrying a European, or Rajiv Gandhi marrying a European is a different kind of. But for middle class people to have this kind of interracial relationship at that stage, I think it's incredibly. It's obviously moving in itself, but it also tells us something about India today, where women are not allowed to choose their romantic partners. So I hope the story of Philip Spratt and Sita Spratt, of Honeyman and his gay lovers, of whom unfortunately I could not do more than allude to it because they weren't the love letters I had for the Spratts. I think, these are stories that I hope will resonate with many people today, not just young people, but maybe particularly young people.
Right. And I mean, so many of these players helped the transition into independent India. In fact, we have some very candid letters as well. We have Miraben writing to Nehru saying that the direction independent India is taking is a heart-rending tragedy. So it seems to me almost like so many of these people were committed to an idea of India, maybe even a Gandhian idea of India.
Yes.
So do you think they kind of washed their hands off modern India as it started going down a path that they didn't truly resonate with?
They were slightly disillusioned. I think at least, so I think you're right about the Gandhian India part, because almost all of them wanted a reduced role for a state, and more importantly, wanted a focus on rural renewal. Village, they wanted to build the economy on agriculture, forestry, horticulture. They were also precocious environmentalists. I mean, if you read what Miraben is writing in the 50s about the dangers of converting the multi-species Himalayan forests into monocultural stands of pine, and what that would do to ecological diversity, to soil conservation, to the needs of the villagers. So yes, I mean, I think they were a cautionary voice. Spratt was a cautionary voice against excessive state ownership of the economy. So yes, I mean, but I think they are larger lessons, but yet it's the significance of each of these lives that stands out. These are very human stories of very unusual, daring, courageous people. I mean, Vandana, we are now at a time where it's very easy for Indians to go to the West and make their mark, And usually these are actually Indians who have been well trained in IITs and IIMs. They don't come from destitute or subaltern backgrounds, and they go, and good luck to them. They want to make their mark in the West. But to make the reverse journey when the British were ruling here, to be a white person, an Irish woman like Annie Besant, or a British woman like Mirabai or an American to come here and identify with the oppressed, to actually, as it were, betray your race, your religion, and your nationality, and often lead really very arduous lives. I think, and yet make a mark. And I think it's yet make a mark, and it's a sign also of maybe the generous and open-minded spirit of the freedom struggle. That people like Gandhi were welcoming of foreigners and were willing to interact with them, learn with them, and struggle with them.
Right. I mean, all of these people are strictly anti-colonial. They're so anti-colonial, but in a way, they came and lived in a state that had created conditions for them to live in India, right? So what does this narrative do to the scholarship around settler colonialism and settler practices, around settler colonialism and settler practices? Because like you said, this is such a rare thing.
So first of all, India was not a settler colonial society in the way in which in South Africa or New Zealand or Australia or Canada were. The British were always a very small part of, demographically, they were a very small part of what India was, right? So in that sense, in the end of my book, I compare these renegades to the white radicals who helped the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa.
Right.
So that is a reasonable or plausible comparison. But the British Raj was left enough spaces for people like them to occupy, and the Indian nationalists were not xenophobic. Gokhale, whom I don't quote in this book, whom I've quoted elsewhere, essentially said, if an Englishman becomes an Indian, we welcome him. And I think it's in that spirit that I've written this book, and it's also in that spirit that the book is dedicated, as you would have noticed, to Jean Drèze, who's a Belgian-born economist, who is a jewel of my country, whom I'm proud to own as a compatriot and as a fellow scholar, and from whom I've learned so much, and without whom there would be no Manrega, the Manrega which UPA brought in, which the BJP scorned and has now adopted, for example. There would be no Manrega without Jean Drèze. There would be no right to food without Jean Drèze. There would be no deep empirical studies of access to health and education without people like him. So I think and I just leave it there. I just dedicate it to him, and I hope people will draw the connection.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, I was just going to ask you, would you count him as one of today's rebels against the Raj? And if so, who are the other people?
I would count him, I would not call him a rebel against the Raj, I would count him as a renegade. Right. I make a distinction between bridge builders like C.F. Andrews and Sister Nivedita, who are building bridges between India and the West, or, people today who are working in social work and so on, and renegades who actually actively identify with India. So he's a post-colonial renegade. There are others too. I mean, someone who died recently, the American-born sociologist Gail Omvedt, who did very important work on, Adivasi and Dalit struggles in Western India. I didn't include them because they came after the Raj ended, and I wanted only people, but they're carrying on that kind of tradition, and I think, So I mean, usually. It takes me a long time to decide whom I want to dedicate a book to, because, their family, their friends. But in this case, it was clear. As soon as I knew I was writing this book, I knew that Jean Drèze was going to be my dedicate.
Yeah, and this book is 20 years in the making. You've been working on it for so long. What were the other major challenges that you went through?
So of course, I didn't work on it uninterruptedly for 20 years, but the idea for it came 20 years ago, or more than 20 years ago, after I published my biography of Very Relvin in 1999. And that's 22 years ago now. And Elvin, his abiding regret was, although he became an Indian, although he worked so strenuously for Adivasi rights, although he died in India, married an Adivasi woman, he never went to jail in the freedom movement. That was his abiding regret. He was rivalrous towards Mirabai, whom he knew well, and who had actually gone to jail. He was envious, not rivalrous, envious was Mirabai. So I wanted to write this book, and then I got involved in other projects, but I kept on collecting material. And originally I had 14 people, and then but those were mostly bridge builders like C.F. Andrews. Then I didn't include him. I mean, Laurie Baker, who's another great personal hero of mine, also I could not include because he did not go to prison. Though he did quite amazing work in basically indigenizing architecture in India. So I kept on gathering material, and the challenge was to interweave their stories and to know how to tell it, because if you are writing about one person, if you're writing only about Verrier Elwin or Gandhi or Nehru or Ambedkar or Indira Gandhi, there's a clear chronological arc. It's cradle to grave, and you follow them year by year, etc., and what they do, and and so on. But if it's like a group portrait of 6 or 7, how do you weave in their stories so that it is a group portrait, but you do enough justice to each one of them and don't lose sight of what binds them together. So it was, and I was fortunate also in the generosity of people who gave me private papers, to get Spratt's letters,
right,
Mirabain's correspondence, and what I don't, I'm not one of those who, in my book, I let my research speak. I don't bring myself into it. I don't, like some biographers will put themselves in the center. I then went to South Africa, and in a village here, I found a cupboard and that kind of stuff, But actually, I had some of these serendipitous discoveries. Ketan, the last character in the book, was the one on whom I had the least material. And I wanted to include him because I'd heard about him and I'd met some disciples of his. And I went to the place he died, which is the Christian Fellowship Hospital in Odanchatram, which is a small town between Madurai and Coimbatore in southern Tamil Nadu. And I was told where he died. And I went, and actually there was a cupboard which I opened, and all his papers were there. Okay, and actually I don't have it's in the house at the moment. I also have his kind of notepad, the wooden kind of thing where you placeholder where you put your notes. And the people who ran the Ketan Trust, Dr. Vinu Aram, who's a well-known social worker, medical social worker in Tamil Nadu, said, Ram, this is of no use to us, you take it. Just do justice to him. Just write about him. So she just said, fine, and she thanked later on in the book. And Spratt's son, Bob Spratt, who lives in Bangalore, and to whom I gave the first advance copy. Because really, to entrust your parents a romantic correspondence to somebody you barely know. I mean, he had read some stuff I had written, but he didn't really know me. And so it's, in that sense, one of the joys of research is finding materials no one else has ever seen before. With Mirabain, for Mirabain, for example, Dharampal, whom I also thank in the book, who was a Gandhian historian who died some years ago, told me, go to the Himalaya Seva Sangh office in Rajghat. Mirabain had a devoted secretary who lived there called Krishnamurti Gupta. He died some years ago. Maybe there'll be stuff he had gathered on Mirabain, and sure enough, it was there. So it's, and of course, there's lots of other stuff I've used, which is in public archives, the Teen Murti and the British Library and so on. But I think using these, the thrill you get when you're looking at a letter, which is why, physical research is so much more exciting than internet research. And, you see a letter which Mirabain has written to Prithvi Singh Azad, whom she desperately loved. And of course, sadly, he didn't reciprocate her love. And it's a handwritten letter, right? It's not composed on a screen. It's a very different kind of thrill. And, I don't know what the future 21st century biographers will have that kind of writing about contemporary people. If you're a biographer of Jean Drèze, he'll have tweets and emails and so on. But will he have these, handwritten letters? One wonders, yeah.
Yeah, and some of them are so touching and so personal. I can imagine how exciting it must have been. There's so many letters exchanged between Gandhi and Annie Besson, which, gave me so much insight into their personalities. And it's so interesting because these are figures that we built this national image around, but we get to see them as people living, going about daily life, but also trying to fight for their cause. And I think that was so exciting.
And also fight against each other, because I think Annie Besant and Gandhi had a kind of rivalrous relationship. So it's like, Gandhi was very much her junior in the freedom struggle, and then he overtook her, which she felt bad about, she felt I overshadowed. And the letters show that kind of tension between two people who had who no longer get along. Yeah, that's sure.
Yeah. She goes from addressing him as Mr. Gandhi to Gandhiji later to back to Mr. Gandhi. And but actually, something I wanted to ask you, and this you allude to in your epilogue, where you make an observation that in contemporary India, Hindus see themselves as destined to be Vishwaguru or teachers of humanity. And in a way, several of the people in your book, whether Annie Besant or Richard Keithan, who I think was really interesting to read about, or even Satyananda Stokes, they were all drawn to Hindu philosophies and Eastern spirituality. Yeah. Does this reinforce Hindus as the Vishwaguru?
Well, some might read it like that. Of course, I mean, I think Stokes puts it beautifully, where he says that Hinduism and Christianity are incomplete without the other. Mm. So, I think that's how I would see it. Of course, they were attracted to many aspects of our culture and our spiritual traditions. I should say rather different. They had a rather deeper understanding of Indian culture and spiritual traditions than some of the, hardcore Hindutvawadis today. They were also much more open-minded. It's not as if they accepted Hinduism and then rejected their Western background or their curiosity about learning or science. And in that sense, this is an argument for the West to learn from us and for us to learn from the West. So, it's a kind of a reciprocal. But yes, I mean, of course, and I mean, the spiritual. Keithan remained a Christian, but interacted with Hindus. Stokes became a Hindu, but did not shun and abandon his Christian past. He thought it's a kind of a deeper fulfillment of what he had been doing. Others like Hahnemann and Spratt were totally secular. Spratt, in fact, wrote a very critical analysis of the Hindu personality, and and he felt the Hindu family life was very constricting. So they had different kinds of reactions to what they found.
Yeah, Keithan, I think, is an interesting example because he came as a Christian missionary, and now missionaries get a bad rap in India, of course, but he very much assimilated into Indian culture, but didn't give up on that Christian past.
He was always a Christian, but he never converted.
And he came with his wife. Did he?
He came with his wife.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to a very syncretic India, which we don't. Because especially today, we hear of missionaries as this demonized force who gave foreign influence, who came and changed Indian culture. Yet we have this man coming and really assimilating. So I thought that was very interesting, which actually brings me to my next question. History today is being contested more than ever. It's a real battleground. Are historians the rebels now, or renegades rather, in Modi's India?
Well, it's a difficult thing because, I try not to get engaged. I used to try and correct errors. For example, 4 or 5 years ago, I might have written a column pointing out that Patel and Nehru had enormously high regard for one another and were colleagues and collaborators and team workers and not rivals and enemies, as WhatsApp history presents them to be. And of course, there are many other such distortions of our recent history. If you take the whole, back and forth between Subhash Chandra Bose, and I wrote a column several years ago on trying to give the truth to the relationship between Bose and Gandhi, which is not something that will please either the Bose acolytes or the Gandhi acolytes. I mean, they're very interesting, complicated, but essentially affectionate relationship and respectful relationship on both sides. But now I realize it's kind of pointless to, quarrel with that and dispute that and just do your own research and all your works, because there's an old statement which an American politician of the 1940s I think first coined, which is very apposite to the world of WhatsApp and Twitter and Facebook and so on, where he said something like this. He said, a lie is halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on. Okay. So alive is halfway around the world. So, I admire people like Mohammed Zubair and Pratik Sinha of Alt News, and I think there's also a site called Boom Live, which I don't follow that closely. And I admire them for what they're doing, and it's important, of course, to puncture myths and outright dishonesty. But I have realized that, I should just write my books, write my columns, and no one knows what people will make of them, and not see myself as an activist for either a historical profession or for true history, scholarly history, in-depth history. I think that would be, I don't have any sort of God complex. I think I'd like to do my work. I'd like to engage with young scholars. I'm in continuous touch with young scholars and reading their manuscripts and working with them. I mean, there's a great, over the last couple of days, I've been reading a great new history of Assam since independence by a brilliant Assamese historian. And, that will deeply enrich our understanding of what Assam is about. Last year, I was working closely with a brilliant young Naga anthropologist who's written a fantastic history of Christianity in Nagaland. Right? So it's nice so I'd rather do that rather than get angry and offended and lose my rag at, what BJP's IT cell is saying and what Rahul Gandhi is saying. I mean, obviously, all of them have a very impoverished understanding of history. It's not just the BJP IT cell. I mean, when I hear Rahul Gandhi actually does not even know the basic facts about his own grandmother's political life, Indira Gandhi. When he speaks on her, I cringe, about her. I cringe because I can see there's howler after howler coming out. But that's okay. That's for one's personal amusement and I'd rather just, continue to do, as long as I am active, to do serious research on new materials and try and write about it in an accessible and engaging way. So the only kind of activist side of me, Vandana, is that, not activist, but outreach side of me, is that I write a column which comes in 10 Indian languages. So I don't want to write only for, the English-speaking elite. This book will also, most of my books have come in Hindi, Malayalam, Marathi, and so on. This book will also come. And then it's up to, no one has control about how one's work is received. But I'm glad for those, fact-checking sites that are there. And I think, more part of it.
Definitely. Well, I think that's a good note to end on, because as history, it becomes more and more of a living room debate. It's becoming much more accessible. It's no longer something that's kept to the ivory tower. I'm sure that this book will give us so much more insight into the lives that different Indians or different foreign-born Indians lived during that time. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Guha.
Thank you.